Mirabelong, the town too tough to die. We'd been away for almost 2 years and Dad's health had deteriorated even further, so it was decided we would go back to Melbourne. So we hopped in the old Chev and we headed back to Melbourne. I can still recall, even though I was a young fellow, I can still recall when we got into the outskirts of Melbourne, I looked up and I saw this strange contraption up the front. And I said to Dad, "What's that, Dad?" And he said, "That's a tram, son." Now, I'd never seen a tram in my life. So I urged him to pump the truck up so we could get beside it. And when we got up there, I just sat there in amazement at this marvellous modern day transport. We eventually got to Grandpa and Grandma's place at Rathmine Street, Fairfield, and we were all delighted, especially Mum, to catch up with my brother Alan, who was about 17 at the time. He was a young man. One of my uncles, Uncle Bill, one of Mum's brothers, was a great hunter. He was a ranger in the forest up there. And in his sleep out where he slept, he had this big stag head with the full head of horns. And I'd never seen anything like this in my life. And I stood at it in amazement. And then I walked out back and they said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I want to see the rest of it." I thought it had stuck its head through the wall and the rest of it was outside, which was to the great amusement of the family. After we got all our pleasantries over with, we then headed out to Mirabelong. Back in those days, it was known as the town too tough to die, and it was there we started another category of our life. There was a family, Manning family, that owned a house and 2 adjacent blocks of land in Newstead Street, Mirabelong, and they agreed to let Dad pitch the tent on the lower block, and they also give him the option of buying the block of land and paying it off at 5 shillings a week, which he accepted. The tent that we put up was the one that we used on the show, and because we were a family of 6, it was bigger than the normal tent. It was 20 to 24 foot long and about 15 to 16 foot wide. Now, initially when we first put it up, the floor was dirt, but soon after that the men of the district come round and helped Dad to install a wooden floor. No electricity in the place. We used kerosene lamps, and there was but one tap, and that was outside the door over at concrete twin troughs. No refrigeration. It was an ice chest, and the fireplace was a wood stove with a corrugated chimney and a flue at the top. It was about 1939, just before the start of the Second World War. The 2 elder brothers joined the army. Frank was not quite 18 and Alan was a couple of years older, of course. And back in those days you had to be 18 to join the AIF, which was the Australian Infantry Forces. And because Frank was under 21, Mum had to sign a form to say she'd given authority for him to join the AIF. And we pleaded with Mum not to sign it. And Frank got very, very cross with us and told us to mind our own bloody business. And so they joined the army. My sister Irene was born. Being the only girl in the family, she was the apple of Dad's eye, but unfortunately he only got to know her for 13 months because he died. I remember the day that happened. Irene was playing on the floor and Dad was sitting on a chair in front of the fire, and all of a sudden he just gave out a groan and he fell off the chair, and the local doctor said he would have been dead when he hit the floor. And Irene crawled across the floor to him. Now, the women of the district come to the fore, and they were all dressed in black, which was a tradition in those days, and they laid Dad out on the double bed at the back of the tent, and they made us 3 boys, Billy, Normie and me, line up, and they said, "Go past one by one and kiss your father goodbye." I'll never forget that. In fact, it affected me for a number of years because I just couldn't get out of my mind how cold that he felt. And what made it also strange was that in all the time that I can remember, we never ever kissed Dad. So this was something. Again, I remember too that the women of the district sent me to school the very next day so Mum could have a bit of a rest. And I remember it must have been a Monday, I think, because it was assembly day and we're all lined up out the front of the school, and And the teacher come up to me, the head teacher of the little school, Miss Allen, I think her name was, and she said, "Johnny," she said, "I saw in the paper that a William Jacobson died." And she said, "Is that any relation to you?" And I said, "Yes, miss." I said, "That was my father." And she made me stand out the front of the assembly with my head bowed with everyone else while they had a minute's silence, And once again, that was pretty nerve-shattering to be standing out there and everyone knowing that your dad had just died. But they were tough times. And the men of the district rallied and come round, and they decided to build a wooden frame over the top of the tent and then install a galvanised iron roof. And Mum was doing it pretty tough. She was virtually on the sustenance, and with the two elder brothers in the army, I think they were earning the two of them were earning 14 shillings a week, which was incredible. And back in those days, too, when a woman became widowed, the state used to step in and lots of times take the children off the woman and make them wards of the state. And I remember Mum sitting there and saying, "No one's going to be taking my kids off me. We'll get by no matter what it takes." And we did. Full credit to her, she was a strong-willed woman, and she had to be. When Billy turned 14, he actually got a job as working a lathe at a local Barlow's Engineering. And back in those days, of course, they had no safety features, and the sleeve of his overall caught in the gearing on the lathe, and it pulled his arm into the machine and tore all the muscle out of his right arm. Of course, he was whizzed off to the Children's Hospital, and they wanted to take his arm off just below the shoulder. And one of the surgeons there, he said, "Now wait a minute." He said, he's but a boy. He said, it shouldn't be the case that a boy goes through life with his right arm gone. He said, "We'll do our best to save this." And he was a remarkable surgeon, and he did. And years later, when Billy got older, of course, he was as strong as a lion, and his right arm was stronger than his left. So, but once again, tough times, and we become hardy to the fact that that's the way we were going to exist. And my elder brother Billy, later on in life, he said, "Son, that we changed the history of the Wild West." And I said, "We did?" He said, "Yeah." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, back in those days when Christmas come round, all Mum could afford for us was a cap gun and a stocking, Christmas stocking. And Mum was a tailoress by profession before she met Dad, and she used to make all Irene's dolls, and she'd buy a plastic face at the local shop and sew it on. But all the kids that were well-to-do in the houses, they would get cowboy suits with the flash hats and the waistcoats and the woolen chaps and the guns and the sidearm. And there were a lot of paddocks in Maribyrnong at the time, and so the kids with all the flash gear on would build a fort. Well, because we had no cowboy suits, we had to be the Indians, the three Jacobsons. Billy would go down to the local poultry farm and pull a few feathers out of the chook's arse and come back and put a band around her head and stick the feather in there. And Billy was a very tan fella and a very strong-looking guy, and he would strip to the waist, take his Guernsey off and wrap it round his waist like a lap with a bow and arrow and a makeshift tomahawk. We used to attack the fort, and of course Billy, being so big and strong, he'd just go straight through the fort and punch up all the cowboys. And he said, "And that, my son," he said, "is the only time in history that the Indians won every battle." And it was.